I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
I'm John Mango, and I'm still wondering what the hell water is, and you're listening to The Great Concavity.
Yeah, good one, John.
Thank you.
Very sweet.
Yep. I just taught that to my students today, so I figured I needed to include it.
Nice and fresh. That's rad. So, John, welcome to episode 20 of The Great Concavity.
Thank you.
20 episodes. That's Matt. We've hung in there.
I know, we're getting close to 1 year, Dave.
Yeah, that's true. I was thinking about that the other day. I think October 12th or something was our first episode last year.
I think about 20
Something like
episodes
that.
in a year. That's a pretty good pace for us.
Yeah,
I think we were shooting for 24, but no one's perfect, right?
Yeah, and then like life gets in the way of living and all that.
But 20 is I'm proud of that. If we get
Yeah.
to 40 in the next year, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
I
I'm
am
good with- I'm
honored
good
to
with
be
that.
on the 20th. Would not want to be on any other one than the 20th one. So.
What about like 25? Is that more of a milestone?
That's
I don't
good,
know.
but
Is that-
at that point, then I can rent a car, and there's just
true.
too much responsibility. I
Right.
like it back here in the 20s.
20 is perfect. Hey,
Yep.
Dave, why don't you do like a 1 second or 10-second introduction of John, and then
Yeah.
let him introduce himself.
Okay, rad.
Sure.
Yeah.
So John Mango is someone that I met recently at the third annual Wallace conference in Illinois, which we just had a couple recap episodes of. And John, you and I met, I think, the first or second day of the conference, and we talked a little bit.
Yep.
And then we randomly bumped into each other at the Bloomington Normal Airport on the way out.
Yes.
And you were like, "Hey, Dave." And I was like, "Oh, hey, John." And then we were on the same flight, and so we swapped seats with somebody.
Yeah.
And we just sat and talked for, I don't know, like a good, how long was that flight to Minneapolis? 2 or 3 hours or something?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. We just talked Wallace and scholarship and life and
Yep.
stuff like that.
Video games. I'm pretty sure Israel was in there.
Oh, yeah. We talked about
There was a lot of stuff. We
my
covered the whole
experience living
globe.
there. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. We did. We talked about music a lot too. And,
Yes, that's
and
right,
board
yep.
games and
Yep.
Netrunner and all that kind of stuff.
yeah,
It was
we
great.
did.
And then talked for like another hour in the airport, and
Yep.
it was like one of like the most like authentic and like transformative conversations I've had in as far as I can remember. It was just such a rad, just fortuitous few hours we got to hang out for.
Yeah.
That's sort of how Dave and I met as well.
That's right. Yeah.
Actually, Dave mentioned that. He was like, "Man, this reminds me of meeting Matt." So.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was crazy. And that the year before, I guess it was in 2015, I got stranded in Chicago for like a whole day. And
Jesus.
I went around and bought a bunch of books and went to some bookstores and just brought them back to O'Hare Airport and ran into Dave. And he was like, what is all these books you've got? Like I had a mountain of books with me. I think I had like 28 books.
How did you find 28 books in an airport?
Carry-on. And my carry-on. Well,
Okay.
I went into town. I took the L train. I took the L into Chicago and went to some cool bookstores. And I just had nothing else to do, so I went back to O'Hare to read them.
You were smart. I would have gotten scared and just bought all the John Grisham books in the little kiosk there.
No.
Had to read that the whole day.
I've actually read, I think, every John Grisham book, so I'm
Oh, really?
I'm caught up there. So.
Oh, nice.
Oh, great.
So tell us what compelled you to go to the conference in the first place. Give us like your background.
Oh, man. Well, I think it was a couple things. One, I really love David Foster Wallace, as did everybody at the conference. But no, he's a singularly important writer to me. Dave. When Dave and I first talked, we kind of joked that it's weird that everyone almost has their own sort of David Foster Wallace origin story. But it just so happens that mine sort of is essential to my understanding of Wallace and why I like him so much and why I think he's such an important writer that needs to be taught and talked about and shared. So if you guys don't mind give a little background into that.
Absolutely.
Please do.
So let's see. Before I liked Wallace, I was really into Joseph Heller, and I was into Cormac McCarthy, and I was into Thomas Pynchon. I liked really weird stuff, and I liked really dark stuff. And that served me well, because in my sophomore year of college, I found out that I had pretty severe depression, and eventually I had to go home and take some time off after, again, a pretty dangerous and shocking, just shocking to my own system and to my family, suicide attempt. And right around that time was actually when it was around 2008. It was when Wallace had killed himself, which is awful. But it was one of these weird things where I didn't get into him by reading his stuff first. It was by reading about him, and there was this way in which reading about a person that had suffered from depression and committed suicide was weirdly comforting, because it let me know in this perverse manner that I wasn't the only one dealing with this stuff. And so while it was really dark, it was also this weird sort of feeling that, like, there wasn't something evil or completely different about me. Others were struggling as well, and I think that's a theme that's pretty common to most people who read Wallace. But one of the ways that sort of folds in on itself is that the more I read him, the more he was directly talking about depression, the experience of depression, and not just one depression, but he was able to sort of give this the whole visible light spectrum of different forms of depression. In Infinite Jest, you have the students who all have anhedonia because they're unable to experience any kind of pleasure. And I knew that. I'd experienced that my whole life, and I'd never really been able to give it that kind of voice. And then you have the I forget his name, the character who wants the operation to get his limbic system cut out, I think, because he's just in excruciating emotional pain all the time, and he's really into the model trains, and I knew that too. And then there's the one with Kate Gombert, who's sitting there, and she's explaining to the doctor what depression really feels like. And I remember every time I read one of those things, it was just like Wallace bored his way deeper and deeper into my soul. Because there was somebody who was actually able to sort of open up these cavernous, scary places in me and walk around in them. And even though he, committed suicide, at least when I read him, he seemed to come out unscathed. And that was sort of, to me, that ended up being the really important function of just fiction in general. And Wallace epitomized that more than any other writer I'd read. There's a Marxist theorist, Terry Eagleton, and he talks about how after we moved into a secular age, literature kind of took the place of religion for a lot of the functions religion has. A lot of the good functions as well. So as Wallace would say, having a place to worship, but also developing emotional ties to other people that are understood in a really meaningful way. And so I really like Wallace's sort of driving ethos that literature is about. He's got one quote where he's quoting a professor of his, and he says, literature disturbs the comfortable and comforts the disturbed. And I think that's absolutely true. It's absolutely true when I read him, and I think that's really true of most good literature in general. And again, these are pretty wide statements, but the thing that I can't help but reiterate as being hugely important is that I think I can firmly say, while feeling a little bit pretentious, but knowing it's not pretentious, is that Wallace actually did help me just live, just be able to say, all right, there's stuff worth sticking around for. It's all right to be in pain. And I find that even though that might sound a little hallmarkish, that it's actually hugely helpful. And maybe one of the things I like the most about Wallace is that whenever I go back to him, I feel a little bit refreshed, because even though those ideas are somewhat simplistic intellectually, they're actually really hard to practice, and we need sort of constant reminders of, or at least I do need a constant reminder of them all the time. So that's a little bit of my background with Wallace. I'm also a member of AA and go religiously. And there's a lot of that in Infinite Jest. And again, he captures exactly why that experience is important to me really, really well. And we can talk about that more as it sort of goes on. But yeah, I would say that's Wallace. Why Wallace? I think Wallace is hugely important as a writer.
Wow, that's really great, John. And we've talked about this a bit in the past on some other episodes, but for me, it's a really interesting dynamic of people who discovered Wallace sort of because of his death or through his death. Yeah. And that, that's not the way that I came to the book or his writing. And so, what I question about that is he went through this experience of AA and depression and chose to write about it in a really veiled, fictional way. Yeah. And pretty much denied it in public.
Absolutely. He did. Yeah.
And so his death came as a real shock, because those of us who had followed his career up to that point, really, he seemed very well adjusted and smart, and had sort of observed this as an outsider, but right. I literally had no idea he was depressed himself and had been, as religiously involved in AA as he had been. And so it really changes the way you read Infinite Jest.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that is the best approach, if he could have helped more people by being a little bit more honest about it and, coming public with his suicide attempts and doing so. And I know not everyone is built to be an activist. Right. Maybe that's that's his way of being out there, is writing these stories and writing these, trying to connect with people on that level.
So I think that's a really fascinating and important point that you're, there's a couple things in there, but I think they're all worth talking about. I think Wallace. So this also gets back to one of my frustrations, is that I don't know him as a person, and yet I absolutely feel like I know him as a person and can talk about his life authoritatively. I know that's not right, but I feel that way, and it's a bizarre thing that I think his fiction's able to do. And so, Matt, you're total. I just watched the Charlie Rose interview with Wallace, where he just flat out denies. He's like, I did a little bit of drugs and my nervous system couldn't handle it. But if you read the D.T. Max biography, he did a lot more than a little bit of drugs.
Sure.
He did a lot of them. And so one of the reasons that I feel comfortable talking about AA, but it's also kind of dicey to talk about AA, is that a lot of AA has to do with humility. And I have to be keenly aware that me talking about this to you guys does not turn into me thinking I'm a poster child for AA, or even positioning myself as such.
Well, and I was gonna say there will probably be people who will hear this and will think that it's taboo for you to even say that you are in AA.
Absolutely, and I think that's missing the point of a big part of AA. So one of the things they talk about is don't promote it. I'm not here to promote it. I'm here to simply relate my experience about it, as it's something that is, I think, very valuable to talking about Wallace and understanding him. I'm not here as an evangelical for it, because that's really not the purpose. One of the ideas that's important to AA is that it really only works if you want it, So just going in because someone else said you should is not is not gonna necessarily work. But again, I I I think that this idea of who was Wallace secretly is really important because one of the things that he's absolutely dealing with is this idea of hiding stuff all the time. Like that's one of Hal's main things that he enjoys is hiding his own drug addiction and whatnot. But Wallace himself is a very personal. Seems to have a hard time being able to parse out when he does want some of the spotlight and when he doesn't. I remember there was a certain interview in which he cops to admitting that he dreamed about receiving the Pulitzer Prize or the Nobel Prize and having all these shining spotlights on him, and then almost quickly retracting it and saying that, oh, that's terrible of me. Why would I ever want to do that? I think one of Wallace's problems was that he was constantly trying to deal with himself, and I think one of the things that he was constantly coming up against was the fact that he recognized how important humility was. I mean, I think that's a big part of Infinite Jest, and there are lots of moments in his interviews that sort of give way, sort of show that he really struggled with that kind of thing. So in of course you end up becoming yourself, there's that section of the book in which Wallace is talking about how much he treasures his regular guyness. And it's one of those really fascinating parts of Wallace where he's saying something, and by saying that, he's actually betraying that he might not really mean what he's saying, which happens a lot for him.
It does, yeah.
I don't know if that gets at your question at all, but...
No, I think it's a really interesting point with AA in general, and that you mentioned in the DT Max book, there's a point where he goes into rehab at Grenada House.
Yes.
And by the way, I think it's unavoidable to talk about his biography for the rest of his life.
Oh yeah.
Just like it is with Hemingway. or
Sure.
Virginia Woolf.
Sure.
Or Hunter S. Thompson, or
Dostoevsky,
someone who's
and
well, especially with the suicide thing, that's going to be almost inseparable. But the DT Max book mentions a thing. I'm very familiar with that book, and there's a point where he mentions when he first went into Grenada House, he reads this pamphlet. It's really an essay by Lewis Hyde. And we've talked about Lewis Hyde on past episodes. He wrote The Gift. And Lewis Hyde wrote an essay called Alcohol and Poetry. And it's mostly about the poet John Berryman.
Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
But it's about a lot of other writers and sort of the idea of American fiction being tied up with drinking. And in there, he makes an interesting connection with Berryman, and I'll talk a little more about this because it's been on my mind, but he really brings it back to irony, and maybe you can talk about this. You kind of hinted at it, and AA, there is this idea, I think, that appealed to Wallace, that sincerity rules everything, and that if you go in there and you're stuck in this ironic mode, that's just not going to work.
Yeah.
And
an ironist in Boston AA is a witch in church.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes,
Exactly.
Yes.
Like
one of the best lines.
You cannot be ironic at all, and it's really just it sort of loses any sort of usefulness or function once you're in recovery.
Well, so that's a fantastic point. A couple things to that. AA has the exact same tenets everywhere, but the sort of culture around it might change a little bit from county to county even. So a lot of what I experience is like there's a lot of joking around that goes on, and even ironic joking, until you get to the part where you have to share. And then it's interesting because it's what people are attracted to is is honesty, is an attempt to thoroughly reconcile with the fact that you're in pain over something. And so if you're being ironic about it, you're very clearly layering on this sort of a very thick wool coat, as if to say, you guys can't come in here. And you can kind of feel it in the room, like this person's deliberately separating themselves from everybody else, and they're not fooling anyone except themselves. And so irony ends up becoming something that's just not helpful to remaining a few steps away from a drink, I think is what ends up happening. So it's I would say it's not necessarily about being honest in that you have to totally know exactly what you're talking about, but it's about being honest in your attempt to try to get at something real. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a really fascinating point. And what makes me curious about that is if it has made you want to, in your AA trajectory, like want to mention Wallace or talk about Wallace with your sponsor, or like bring up,
Actually,
or share the book.
So it's funny you say that, because when I first got in, everyone refers to the 12 steps as the 12-step book as the big book. And I thought they were talking about either God, either the Bible or Infinite Jest. And so I'd bring it up, and there have been plenty of people who have been like, oh yeah, I read that, or no, I tried to get through that, and they just kind of brushed it aside. But I haven't really brought a lot of Wallace to it, because the most valuable stuff, I would say, is just personal experience, and
right.
and attempting to get that across. I think where the overlap between AA and Infinite Jest really happens is when I talk to people outside of meetings, and they're looking for something that is really influenced by AA thought. So it'll either be William James, the
Boom, exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
Verities of a Religious Experience, which the 12 Steps book actually
Mentions.
cites, or it'll be Infinite Jest, which also cites the Verities of Religious Experience, which
Lenz's
is a fantastic.
Coke stash.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Lenz's Coke stash is inside of it, which is a wonderful little warning of what Infinite Jest could be.
Yeah.
Well, and in fact, I think on episode 13 or so, we had Rob Short on, and we talked a lot about AA and the big book. And I asked Rob what philosopher had the most influence on Wallace, and he said William James.
Yeah.
And the more quotes that he gave me, the more convinced I was that he was correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's William James. Well, it's interesting, Matt, because I think this also kind of William James is another personality that sort of reflects a lot of the way Wallace conducted himself. Where in the Verities of Religious Experience, James is talking about the sick mindset, which is essentially somebody with depression, and he talks about a letter that a man sent to him, in which the man described himself as being a kind of cadaver who could not move, and for fear that the movement would make him feel worse, and wanted to move because he was in so much pain simply by sitting there. It turns out that the letter that was written to him, James was actually wrote that, and it was his own experience he was talking about, but there was something about it that he just didn't want to share. He didn't want to admit that was part of what was his own suffering. And so I think you do have I think you have a sort of history of people dealing with really intense depressive stuff who try to dive into it, but are also kind of afraid of admitting the kind of weakness they might see there. Again, I don't think depression is weakness whatsoever, but when your mind is in that place, it's really hard to sort of see yourself as anything but the lowest thing you can imagine. So we would have to think that some of that would apply to Wallace as well.
Well, and back to the big book, the first couple chapters are Bill W.'s story.
Yes, absolutely.
And he is basically an incurable drunk.
Yeah.
And anything that he tries, it just does not stick, and he fails. And eventually he meets this guy who was also a drunk, and he comes to his house, and he's like, I totally solved it. And he's like, how the hell did you do that? And he's just in total awe of the guy. No, and the guy says, I had a religious conversion.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, well, I tried everything else except for religion at this point. And, that was sort of an eye-opening thing to me, that because, what we outsiders know of AA is that it is somewhat agnostic.
Yeah, I would still say
it allows you to have and it still allows you to have this idea of however you see the creator or a higher power.
Right. I think so this gets into a lot of Wallace stuff, and I think it's one of the reasons that I like AA a lot, is that it's God as you know him. So really, I know people who use God as an acronym, and they consider it group of drunks, and it's sort of the power of the group itself, of being a part of something larger that keeps them sober. But I think ultimately AA is this extraordinarily pragmatic and compassionately pragmatic way of looking at simply having a really hard problem that puts you in the middle of two things that's nearly impossible to escape. And so there is a kind of religiousness to it, in that there are some key tenets that you don't want to violate, like don't drink, don't use, come to meetings, talk to your sponsor, work the steps. But then all of the details are sort of filled in by our own experiences. And so the idea of some kind of religious conversion is different for every single person, and comes around in a different way for every single person. I also think it's one of the reasons that the scene that's closest to a religious conversion for Don Gately is that scene where he saves Randy Lenz, because we don't get this detailed interior monologue. We simply see the action of what's going on, and are left to interpret what's going on inside of Gately to ourselves, which is very reminiscent of the way AA works. That they call it a program of action. So I think that kind of ethos it shows up in Infinite Jest a lot.
You're confirming my thesis right now, John. Thank you.
That's what I came here for. It was really a plant to confirm Dave's thesis.
Oh, good.
Well, and what else interests me about that, John, is that it's sort of a last resort, right? And
absolutely. Yes.
In Bill W.'s story in the big book, he doesn't want to deal with religion until he literally has tried everything else.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the John Berryman story too, in that pamphlet, or if you just read a biography of John Berryman, you'll see that he tries everything. He goes to rehab multiple times.
Yep.
And around, I think in 1970, 1971, he reports that he does have a kind of religious conversion that he can't explain. And I mean, it's just very rare for a guy who totally denied it for years, and fought against it actively and just said, I'm an atheist, I have nothing to do with this, and would lie about anything just to get another drink.
Yes.
But then later on admits, I actually did have kind of a religious experience in this.
I mean, I think that's really important, Matt, and I can give you my experience with that. They call it the gift of desperation, which really means you're suffering so much that you have no other options. Maybe logistically, if someone stepped back, you could be like, oh, you could go and talk to this person, A, B, and C, but you in your own consciousness just have run out of options, and you somehow have gotten lucky enough to come across this thing which you've reviled, or just been totally, as Don Gately is, you just don't care about it. There doesn't seem to be anything to do with it. You haven't spent much time thinking about it. It's kind of like bare knuckle sort of religiousness where I'll put it this way. The steps are written in a really fascinating way, where the first step is to admit that you are an alcoholic,
Right.
and that you are powerless over alcohol or any other mind-altering substance. The second is to admit that there is a power greater than yourself. Now, if you've admitted the first, you've already admitted the second, because you've admitted that alcohol is more powerful than you. And the third is to admit that there's a power that can restore you to sanity. That's where I think one of the biggest leaps of faith comes in, because that's where you have to say, all right, yeah, alcohol is more powerful than me, but what if something could help me? And so it's this really sort of subtle way of sort of going in and asking people to be willing to build, to learn how to trust again, to learn how to have some kind of faith again. And there's a lot of other stuff that goes on, right? You're surrounded by a group of people that really want to help you. You're given time to have intensive moments with people that also want to help you. But I do think that sort of very subtle hinting at something bigger than yourself is the kind of logic that Wallace follows through Infinite Jest to sort of bring us to our own sort of spiritual awakening.
Right. That syllogism that you just gave, John, reminds me of. Are you guys familiar with Saint Anselm's ontological argument?
What is it? I don't think
he's like a medieval theologian who came up with this argument for the existence of God. That's like, he says that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
And then the argument's basically like, if we define God as like the greatest conceivable being,
right,
then the greatest conceivable being must actually exist in reality, because if he didn't, then he wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being.
Right.
And then so like through this weird kind of like series of weird logical steps, it becomes this like classical argument for the existence of God, and I'm still like very like skeptical of it, and I don't really know what to make of it.
Well, that's fascinating, Dave, because I think you're right. The same logic is at work there. I would say the difference is that with AA you have this sort of gnawing desperation to get better, whereas with the God one, I there's probably some pretty rabid monks or whatnot that really need that to be logically true, but there may not be as pressing and immediately pressing.
We'll get Edmund back on the show to talk about it next time.
You know what? That is a total phrase from Infinite Jest too. That gift of desperation.
Yes, it is.
And I'm looking at the book now, and there's this passage. If it's all right with you guys, I think I'm just going to read it for a second.
Oh, please do.
Where he talks about it. And he's talking about Gately, and he says, of course, he hates them, the crocodiles, for making him feel like he fears them. But oddly, he also ends up looking forward to a little sitting in the same big nursing home cafeteria with them and facing the same direction that they face every Sunday. And a little later, he finds he even enjoys riding at 30 kilometers per hour tops and their perfectly maintained 25-year-old sedans when he starts going along on the white flag commitments to other Boston AA groups. And he eventually heeds a terse suggestion and starts going out and telling his grisly personal story publicly from the podium with other members of the white flag, the group that he gave in and finally officially joined. This is what you do if you're new and have what's called the gift of desperation and are willing to go to any excruciating lengths to stay straight. You officially join a group and then put your name and sobriety date down on the group's secretary's official roster, and you make it your business to start to get to know the other members of the group on a personal basis, and you carry their numbers talismanically in your wallet. And most importantly, you get active with your group, which in Gately's Boston AA, active means not just sweeping the floor after the Lord's Prayer and making coffee and emptying ashtrays of Gasper butts and ghastly spit-wet cigar ends, but also showing up regularly at specified PM times at the White Flag Group's regular haunt, which is the E-lit, the final E. It was supposed to be the elite, but the E ran out. E-lit diner. Anyways, I'll end it there, but that gift of desperation, it comes up several times in the book, and it definitely made an impression on me, because you think desperation is not a gift. Right? It's counterintuitive.
Well, and there's a lot of complexity in that, because I remember the first time I read this book, I was still out drinking a lot, having a hard time. And so I kind of like glossed over this stuff. It was interesting to me, but it didn't resonate with me anywhere. And then whenever I read it again, there's this glowing joy to it. Like the whole time this is happening, yes, Gately is struggling, yes, but I can feel the kind of wonder that comes along with it. With how the fuck is this actually working? It's working, and there's something. I think that's why I love the scene with the Irish guy who takes a solid dump for the first time, because it's really
a turd with a pulse.
Yes, absolutely. It's really lovely, but it's also lovely because it's so incredibly joyful. This guy is describing this sort of transcendent moment, and he's describing it through shit, and it's such a cool. For me, it's such a cool juxtaposition of literally taking human garbage, human feces, and sort of transmogrifying that into something that it represents something really beautiful, which is somebody actually recovering. So the book, I think, after having gone through this stuff for me, it's incredibly sad. It is also funny, but it's also joyful in parts, and I didn't get that the first time through.
Well, and I think you're right. I just want to say, I think you're right that it is a triumphant thing for him, that he is writing this after breaking through a real mental barrier in his life, and that he came very close to dying.
Oh yeah,
in 1989, 1990, and he survived. And I think his way of sort of thanking the universe was by telling this story.
Yeah.
And like I said, I just didn't realize at the time that it was basically autobiographical.
Right. There's that part in the D.T. Max book where D.T. Max gets in contact with the guy that Don Gately is physically based on. And the guy's really frustrated, and he says, the guy was
Big Craig.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Big Craig.
He was mining us for material. Which
yeah, well, he asked him. He was like, "Hey, what was your impression of him?" And he says, "My impression of him was that he was a writer who was just there mining us for material. He was looking for material."
That's right. Again, we have the very weird complexity of Wallace trying to work out what's okay and what's not okay when it comes to public performance.
Yeah.
But the woman who is based on Pat Montesian, who was the real director of the Grenada House. You can go and listen to some interviews with her, and she kind of says the complete opposite.
No
she
kidding.
Says that,
I'm gonna have to listen to that.
You should listen to it. It's on Boston Public Radio, and we'll link to it in this episode.
Yeah,
but she says, Wallace really cared about these people and really was humble.
I believe he did. Yeah.
And he very easily could have just said, "Oh, I'm this published author, and I know better than you guys." But he literally never did that, and was very good at taking direction. And I mean, maybe you can speak to that a little bit about like what kind of humility it takes to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to tell that story, because it's one that reminds me that I need to humble myself. Maybe right now, actually. So I remember I was lucky that I had a really bad bottom. I was just like, it was, big suicidal mess, really frightening scenario, and I was not admitting to myself that I had trouble drinking, and for me that meant that whenever I picked up, I didn't know whether it would be one drink or it would be 12 drinks. I just had no control in that respect. And I remember I was just so down on myself. And I was really lucky to have a very good friend who was in the program. And so my mom Mom, I love you. Thank you for making me do this. She's probably going to listen to this, but thank you for making me do this. She made me promise that I'd talk to him, because like she's like, I don't want to be put through this stuff again. So I did, and we went to our first meeting. It was in the basement of a church, and I get there, and I was just so cynical and angry and self-pitying, and just like I hadn't really, like, my beard had grown out and I was looking all scraggly, and I had like an old sweatshirt on with a bunch of stains, and my hair was greasy and poking out everywhere, wearing ripped jeans. And I sit down in this circle of, like, in this dingy basement with all these people, and in my head I'm just like, oh, look at these gross, disgusting. And as I'm saying that in my head, I'm like, shut up, John, you're no better than them, you're a piece of dirt. Like, doing this weird mind game with myself where these people are terrible and I'm terrible and everything's terrible. Just not fun at all. And then so the meeting starts, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, how did my life get to this point? This is the worst place I could be in. And the woman goes, all right, tonight we're going to talk about gratitude. And I just go, oh, fuck. What do I have to be grateful for? Are you fucking kidding? It's okay. Is it okay if I swear?
Oh, yeah.
That's
okay.
fine. That's fine.
All right. It is part of the story. And there's this guy next to me. He's like in his late 40s. He's got a plaid button down tucked into his jeans. Looks kind of like Tim Allen in Home Improvement, except a little more hard bit, and his eyes are clearer. And he goes, when you said the word gratitude, I thought to myself, God damn it, I don't want to talk about gratitude tonight. And I was like, I want this guy. He knows what I'm talking about. And the guy suddenly, just like, his posture changes. His voice gets a little more serious, and he sits up in his chair and he goes, but you know what that is? That's the disease. That's the thing that wants to keep me down here, keep me feeling terrible all the time. Because if I listen to that thing and I follow everything it's going to say, it's going to put me back out on the street. I have a lot to be grateful for. And as he was saying this, it just sort of was starting to bubble off and to radiate gratitude. And it was the first time in, I don't know, 10 years that I started feeling grateful, and I didn't have anything, I didn't think I had anything in that moment to feel grateful for. It was just this free-floating gratitude, and it was sort of like this shock where I was like, holy shit, I have been so selfish and so unaware of so much. Again, I've been so unaware of the water I've been swimming in this entire time, that I just got like this kind of weird buzz. And I'm very lucky. A lot of people don't get an experience like that. I did. And I'm deeply grateful for it happening. So I kept coming back. I was still terrified. Sometimes still am still terrified to go. A lot of the times I don't want to, but I just kept coming back, and I found more and more than the graduate classes I was taking, I was really learning and practicing how to be a decent human being, in a very rudimentary and thus really important kind of sense. I also found that, like, the stuff that I had wanted to believe in when I was reading Wallace and thinking about compassion and wanting to help other people, I was actually starting to do that stuff, and I was really happy that I was able to do that. I was really grateful for the opportunities to do that, because I didn't have the sort of capacity or the awareness to do it before. And it really brought the way I understood Wallace. Just, it sort of really changed it. Wallace for me became less about attempting to soothe my own pain, and understanding that what he had laid out in most of his work was a way to more deeply empathize with other people, and because of that, help myself in the process of I'm sort of losing my train of thought here, but
well, I mean, that gratitude piece that you're talking about, I think is really interesting to look at what we were talking about earlier about the genesis of Infinite Jest in general.
Sure.
Because, in retrospect now, I see that I believe Infinite Jest is like the greatest love letter to AA ever written.
Oh, I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
And a lot of that, and mostly stems from Wallace's gratitude towards it as a program really saving his life.
Yeah.
And that nothing else he had tried before really worked.
Yep.
And so his gratitude towards that, it sort of translates into this constant level of humility.
That's fascinating, Matt, because I think this book, when I read it, it's so emotionally generous, and that would make sense as to where that sort of emotional generosity kind of comes from.
Well, I like I say, I think a lot of it comes from him really trying to get out of that shell of narcissism and get out of that shell of looking towards, your default setting of yourself is like, this is who I really am.
Right.
And it's like, actually you are, especially when you're at an AA meeting, you're no better than the person sitting next to you.
Yeah.
And,
absolutely.
I've never been to an AA meeting, but I've met many people who have been through the program, and I've learned that as a central tenet, right? That everyone is sort of on the same level.
Yeah.
And Wallace reflects that. You mentioned, in your opening thing of This Is Water, is that that's one of the points that he makes, that, if you are sure what reality is and what's really important, then you don't want to consider that some of this stuff is pointless or annoying.
Right.
That you think everything, you're going to be annoyed by everything.
Yeah. I think you're hitting on some really, I keep saying this, but you bring up some good points, that I think one of the reasons, again, Wallace fascinates me as both a writer and a thinker is that he seems to be advocating for a kind of very fluid relationship with the world, one that is constantly wanting to take in new information without a kind of immediate judgment on it. I think that's sort of what we get in the atheist story, and I think a lot of that relies upon the viewer, the reader, the listener, being able to maintain that emotional status of being humble, which is a really hard thing to do. Again, one of the things about Wallace I love so much is that these ideas are talked about a lot just in culture in general, but they're really, really hard to do. To use some more This Is Water talk day in and day out.
Right.
Well, and the other thing that really strikes me about that, what you're saying, is that it's a really old idea.
Yes,
and that
absolutely.
We're talking about ancient religions here.
Verities.
We're talking about William James, and that you're talking about, this is not something that is really revolutionary, that it's something we're just blind to because we're living in this sort of modern condition where we choose not to see it.
Right.
And even this idea that depression and alcoholism is a choice, right? And that happiness is a choice. This is an old treatment of depression theory that goes way back to our first ideas of depression. And I think what Wallace struggled with, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, is that when you describe it to someone else, it sounds like a cliche.
Oh,
and it's like,
absolutely. One of the so especially that, a couple things. That idea of alcoholism and depression being a choice. It's fascinating because the current conversation around both of them, although I think it's changing, renders it so that it's sort of this like, how do I put this? It's sort of like people are failures for choosing to become depressed or alcoholics, when actually what's going on is this really complicated set of behaviors that are developed over time, where at the core there's a choice to be made. But it takes a whole lot of work, both intellectual and emotional work, to navigate oneself into the position where you can finally recognize what that choice is. And that it's extremely important to treat those who haven't yet made that choice, to do so with the utmost compassion available. And again, this all sounds nice. It's way harder when somebody's saying, "Oh, the world sucks," all of that kind of stuff. But I think that's, again, this ties into the idea that cliches are, and Wallace again talks about this a lot, cliches are fundamentally important things that we have to do a lot of work to understand. That ideas aren't good simply because they're kind of new or feel exciting. They're good when we've put in the work to understand what they're really trying to tell us. So if I'm describing to somebody my depression, what I'm really looking for ultimately is not that person to really admit or really claim that they totally understand depression, but simply to sit there and be able to say, okay, I believe you're having this experience and it sounds really hard. Which I think is a very different way of
reaction.
Yeah.
One thing I want to ask you while we have you on the line is if you have a favorite part of Infinite Jest or a favorite quote or anything like that.
I absolutely do. Yes.
Just locked and loaded.
Yeah. So this would be, it's on page, 203. And it's the list of things that you learn in rehab.
Oh yeah.
It's loaded with stuff that I like, but
I have that bookmarked.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So if there's one line in here that I think I love more than most writing, that there is such a thing as raw, unalloyed, agendaless kindness. That sentence. There's a lot of stuff I really love in here, but I think when I read that, it was the verve with which it sort of comes across, and just this confident assertion that kindness isn't necessarily this sort of neo-Darwinist idea that everything is selfish in the end, and all. Because I remember growing up and getting into so many arguments and really hating that idea to the point where it drilled itself into my head during depression, when I was depressed, and I'd have internal battles with the idea that I was like, no, there has to be some kind of
some kind of altruism in the universe.
yeah. And to read something that was 175 pages into this massive book that would be even longer, that just flat out stated it, didn't care at all about being subtle in that particular manner, was
the whole show don't tell thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
But I loved that he had the willingness to just tell in that moment. It seems like a perfectly right thing to do, because maybe there are some things that we should just tell, that we should just say, and I think that's one of them. To me, it's sort of a radical celebration of the really good parts of us, the light parts of us, the parts that, as he says in his interview with McCaffrey, we should give CPR to, right?
Going back to that statement on page 203, I'm looking at my old copy, now 20 years old, of Infinite Jest. On the page before, on 202, I had underlined 3 sentences 3 times.
No kidding.
And, it's the sentences that say that you do not have to like a person in order to learn from him, her, it.
Yes.
And that loneliness is not a function of solitude.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
Per Donald Trump, that evil people never really believe they are evil, but rather that everyone else is evil.
Right? Oh my God, that's so
that's
fitting.
Very on the nose.
I think there's another one in here that's like the most the scariest people are the most scared, something along those lines.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
good.
that fits with Trump as well,
Yeah.
I think.
Sure does.
I want to ask Dave if he has any other favorite quotes, but one that I've been thinking about a lot too, which when you're talking about AA, it leads me back to a thing. It's on a couple of different points in the book. Page 952 is one where it's the kind of a fake cliche motto of the Tennis Academy that says life is like tennis and that those who serve best usually win. and that I just love like that he put crap like in there, sort of ironic but sort of serious.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the things. Go ahead, Matt.
I was just gonna say if Dave wanted to chime in there with any, now that we're just like riffing on Infinite Jest favorite quotes.
Wow, really putting me on the spot here. I don't have anything prepared. But I think that if I sort of dug through my thesis, there's probably a few lines, probably relating to Mario, that I would posit as.
Well, you don't have to have anything locked and loaded, but you can just nod your head and be like, "Yeah, boy."
Yes, I'll see if I can dig up a few for next episode. How about?
Yeah.
All right. Let me go back to asking you then. How long have you been in AA? When did you first read Wallace? Could you lay out that timeline?
Oh yeah, sure. So let's see. I think I first, 2008 was when I first read Wallace. I've been
you
AA,
mentioned that.
I've been in AA for about a year and a half now. So
way after, right?
Yeah, way after, because there were still. I think I was a kind of person that like it took certain tough circumstances to really bring out bad drinking behavior in me. Not, I kind of struggled with it that whole time, but I was also trying to do as best I could, still having no idea what I was doing. It really took AA to be able to let me stop drinking. It was just really hard for me to do that on my own. So I think that's why I kind of talk about Wallace pre getting sober and then reading him sober, is that there's still a lot there for people who, or for me when I was suffering a lot. The book is vast and nuanced enough so as not to preclude any readers who don't directly deal with the struggles of getting sober. I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
And you know what else? I don't know if at the beginning did you mention where you're located?
So right now I'm located in Burlington, Vermont. I teach some writing courses at UVM. But I am from, and most of the things that I talked about in terms of, depression and whatnot took place back in Hebron, Connecticut, which is where I grew up.
And so we probably have some listeners in Vermont, and I'm going to encourage them to get in touch with you through some back channels through us if necessary.
That sounds great. I would love that.
Yeah, sweet.
What part of Connecticut did you mention? What was that? Hebron?
Hebron. It's right outside Hartford, so like central Connecticut.
Okay.
Suburbia,
Whaler
Cowtown.
country.
Yeah, that's right.
Back when the
Absolutely.
whalers existed.
The whale. The whale.
That's a great logo.
I spent a great Christmas in Connecticut.
Did
I had
you?
some roommates when I lived in New York.
No kidding. Whereabouts in Connecticut?
Right on the coast. God, what was the town? Now I'm going back 15 years. Norwalk. So
Norwalk.
Norwalk. Down toward,
Okay. Yeah, so if I could do a quick...
Also the name of a virus.
Is it?
Was it Norwalk virus?
Yeah, I contracted it a few years ago. It's just like a really bad flu, and it just rings you right out. It's terrible.
That sounds awful.
So way to go,
you're always
naming a
getting
city
sick.
after that, guys. So in your like personal trajectory here, John, you've been reading Wallace for almost a decade now.
Yeah.
And now you're a grad student, right?
Yeah. Well, I technically
university.
done with the grad work part of
Oh,
it.
you're fully finished, right?
Yeah.
So that brought you to the conference. You presented at the conference. What's some of the academic stuff that you've done with Wallace's work? And it's cool to hear that like your personal trajectory has led you into like this academic discipline, studying Wallace in a formal way.
Yeah. So what I was doing for the conference was I was really trying to iron out that how do I write about a person who I think I know and I feel like I have a relationship with, and yet in all reality I don't. And it had to do with let's see, the joke in Infinite Jest, and the Infinite Jest as entertainment, and then the Suffering Channel, because I was looking at the way Wallace represents the artist's processes of creation, and I was trying to just see, like, look through his eyes. All right, what does Wallace see the function of art being? And there's something I think really neat when you compare the joke to Infinite Jest. The joke is himself's most effective.
Après garde.
Yeah, right. And also, like, it lines up with his intentions, in which he just hates the audience. And so he's literally playing a joke on them, and it just repels them whatsoever. And then Infinite Jest it's a lot of things, but one of the things is it's kind of a desire for him to help Hal find a voice, and for him to find a voice himself. But instead, he seems to be too mollifying of the audience, in which he has a mother figure apologizing for birthing you into such pain, which is a really easy way to anesthetize a viewer into sort of feeling okay now, but not challenging you to do anything. And if you look at a kind of middle ground, you can see Wallace saying that there's needs to be a provocation, but there also needs to be an understanding of the kind of pain on the reader's part. But so that was what that paper was trying to get at. I don't know if it was fully successful. I think what I really want to do, I think what I really am trying to do now is bring about a certain kind of vocabulary of emotional literacy that's driven by Wallace, because I think something that is really important to teaching writing, and to just, again, literature in general, is that it for me it helped me understand my own inner world, and thus the inner worlds of other people, and because of that, I think helped me become more compassionate, and helped me be willing to wade into the pain of another person, rather than just be like, oh, get away from me, that hurts. And so it'll be using philosophers like Hegel, which we don't have to get into here if we don't have time, because that gets really erudite really quick. But
I'm
Do you
ready.
know that,
I'm
you know
ready.
that
Let's
George
do it.
Saunders, how he talks about the first time he met Wallace, and they were like,
Yes,
having breakfast,
yes.
and he was like really scared that they were going to start talking
Yes.
like deconstructionism
Hegel.
or Derrida was going to come up, and
yeah.
Saunders was terrified of that, and then they just talked about like normal life stuff. About their families
Wallace
and
asked
stuff,
him
and so-
about like the schools for his kids, and
Yeah.
which is great. I mean, I love that connection, because Saunders, to me, is the biggest torchbearer. I mean, he does his own stuff in his own right, but he's the biggest torchbearer of what Wallace was doing as well,
Yeah.
which was this very compassionate approach to the pain of other people,
Yeah.
and sort of invoking us to try to reconcile or try to deal with that. But so, all right, I'll very briefly give you the Hegel idea. I think one of the things I also like about Wallace is he dives into the problem of solipsism very deeply, which to me is a terrifying thing, especially experiencing depression. Hegel, in his subject-object relations, which is to say me being a subject or a consciousness that experiences itself, is always going to relate to you guys as objects, or things that are not immediately made aware and urgent to me. And the interesting thing Hegel does is he says that the object is always a part of the subject, which essentially dissolves that barrier that keeps solipsism alive. And he does this through a few different logical moves. One of the biggest one essentially being that two subjects sort of constitute each other. It's only through me recognizing myself through your eyes or voice that I'm able to then really feel as if I'm a full subject. Which is a really fancy way of saying that because we're talking, I'm able to recognize myself as being a person, which means that I have to then recognize you as being a person. And I think that's a hugely important fundamental shift away from the sort of enlightened individualism that tends to be the basic model of how we view humans as sort of like people that interact with each other simply because it's for our mutual benefits. Instead, he's saying, no, on a phenomenological level, we're totally enmeshed with each other. And from there, I think with that standpoint, suddenly feeling somebody else's pain and really attempting to understand it and sit with it because they're presenting it to you, it's no longer... It becomes almost a mandate to do that, as it's a part of our basic makeup to do so, rather than saying, oh, that person makes me uncomfortable because they're sad, I don't want to have any part of their sadness. That becomes the bizarre behavior. And I think, to me, that's a hugely important shift in the way we approach what an individual is, what a community is, how it is we really interact. And I think Wallace shows this in a shitload of his work. It is all over brief interviews with hideous men. He's got the stories, the porousness of certain borders, which are exactly about that enmeshment. So that's what I'm going to be working on. I'm currently working on, and will be working on more in the future. Yeah.
That sounds brilliant, man.
We could talk about that for another hour.
I would love to. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That sounds great. Well, we look forward to all future publications.
Thank you very
John
much.
Mango.
Thank you very much.
Hey, John, before we wrap up, do you have any places online you want to direct people to if they want to read any of your stuff or get in touch with you? Or?
Sure. I have a blog that I update about once a month. I think the most recent entry about it does deal directly with Hal in Infinite Jest and talking about the David Foster Wallace convention. It's WordPress. It's one of those WordPress websites, but the name of it is Hazards of the Course, which is a line from a John Ashbery poem. So if people want to look that up, or they can just contact me on Facebook. My name's John Mango. I'm also on Twitter at callmejohnmango. Apparently, I really like my own name.
Who doesn't like your name?
Perhaps I need to work on that humility a little bit more.
No, I love getting to say your name. That last name just has a sweet ring to it.
Thank you, Tate.
Tell us the name of your blog one more time. The name of your blog.
It is Hazards of the Course at WordPress, so it's probably wordpress.com/Hazards of the Course.
Sweet. We'll link to that in the show notes. And I'm glad you told us about this, John. I don't think I knew about your blog, so I will be checking that out ASAP.
Cool. There's a lot of stuff about depression and dealing with that kind of stuff. So
awesome. It's great. Well, John, we want to ask you, do you have any sort of final thought for the evening?
I'm still wondering what the hell water is. Also, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on, guys. It really, it's a pleasure talking to both of you, and it really means a lot. It'll mean a lot to my mom, too. Mom, love you.
Hi, Mom.
Dad, too.
That's awesome, John. We just want to thank you so much for coming on and for being willing to talk about this really personal, really hard, messy stuff. And I remember you saying to me in the airport when I asked you if you'd want to come on and talk about this stuff, if you'd be willing, you were like, yeah, because I mean, it's important that this conversation is out in the world and that people don't have to feel like they're going through this stuff alone.
Yeah, I really do think that one of the best ways, for me at least, to combat sort of just, I don't want to use ignorance, but just like the general mysticism and fear that surrounds, I don't know, depression, suicide, alcoholism, all that stuff, is to really talk about it, and because there's actually not that much to be afraid of, and there's a lot of ways that people can get help. It's really hard, don't get me wrong, like if you love somebody who's going through this stuff, it's absolutely really hard, but I think we make it a little easier on each other when we feel that it's an easier thing to talk about.
Yeah. Destigmatization.
Yes. Big
totally.
fan.
Yeah, that's great, man. Awesome.
Thanks so much, guys.
Well, hey, John, it was really great having you on, and we really appreciate you sharing with us tonight.
Yeah.
And I hope you get credit towards like this counts for something, because it certainly counts for us.
Yeah, your tenure package or whatever, maybe.
Yeah, right. No,
Put it on the CV.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to be here.
And like every good conversation we have on the show, I feel like it could go for another hour easily. Like it went by so quickly.
Absolutely.
Just because like I really enjoyed your stories and what you had to say.
Thank you. Yeah. That means a lot to me. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It was fantastic.
Great,
yeah, dude.
Great.
And we haven't even like talked about music or film or board games or video games or anything yet.
Let's do like 2 minutes on Netrunner. You guys both play Netrunner?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. This is my dream come true. Okay, so John and I started talking about board games in our conversation at the airport.
Yep.
And of course, you know, any marginal window I have to drop Netrunner, like I take it. And Rachel, my wife, is profoundly embarrassed by this, but I do it anyways. So John, you were like, yeah, that sounds cool. I described the game to you. And so you went out and bought it, you and your friend.
I did. I went with my friend Mark Hengslinger. Hi, Mark.
Yeah.
And I was like, Mark, I think you'd really like this Dave guy, but we absolutely need to go buy this game. And so we went out.
You pitched me to the guy before you pitched the game to him. I like that.
Yeah. That seems to be a running trend with me, is know the person before the product. And then so Mark and I sit down, and Dave sent me the online.
Like tutorial video,
tutorial, and I read the book a little bit, the handbook a little bit, but I didn't realize how Byzantine parts of it could get. Nonetheless, Mark and I sat down outside on a windy day and spent 2 hours parsing our way through the first game, and it was amazing. It was so neat. I had never played a game like that, an asynchronous,
asymmetrical,
asymmetrical kind of game like that before, where like I was this corporate entity and felt like this hugely powerful, and he was the scrappy hacker. And so we got to play it a few more times, and it just sort of, one of the things that really opened up to me about it was that there's a lot of like poker face kind of stuff involved in it. And that is some of the most fascinating stuff, is that somehow in the midst of this game that has rules that are as strict as magic, there are these moments for trying to like fake out the other player, and Mark took advantage of me a whole bunch of times because I was like, I think you left this open because you're one of those things. So I'd attack and get tracked or something like that. But totally. It's really good. I hung out with Mark today and we didn't play it. I don't know why. We should have played it again.
Can you say the name again? It's Android Netrunner.
That's right. Android Netrunner. I'm actually gearing up to go to Roseville, Minnesota.
Yeah, I meant to ask
November,
you about that. Yeah.
For Netrunner World, the World Championships. I will get my ass handed to me. I'm sure of it.
Can you live tweet it or something?
Yeah, I could do some live tweets. I think that would be appropriate. I'll do them from the Concavity account and just like flood everyone's.
Currently, 12-year-old is hacking my ass off.
Yeah. Well, that's great, John. I'm glad you picked it up and have been enjoying it.
Oh, it's such a good game.
Can't recommend it enough to people.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It will take over your brain, though, if you let it, if you really get into it.
I'll just start thinking.
There's a caveat there. Caveat emptor.
Yeah.
So Dave is second only to David Foster Wallace. His level of commitment to Netrunner, I would say, is second only to David Foster Wallace.
Yeah, those are like my two main jams. If you follow my Instagram or my Twitter, it's like those are the two things. So, yeah, I could happily do a podcast about Netrunner, but there's already a ton that are fantastic.
No kidding.
I have some friends in Vancouver who do one called Terminal 7. It's just like it's bananas.
That.
Yeah, it's really good. My friend
right.
Jesse does that. So Jesse and Nels. So if they're listening to a David Foster Wallace podcast ever, hey guys, way to go. Keep up the good work. Yeah, cool. Well, awesome. Thanks again, John. We really appreciate it, man. And keep us posted with all of your future Wallacean doings.
I will be sure to. I'll send you emails from time to time and
right on.
Touch.
That's great.
This was great. Thank you. Thank you for letting me talk to you guys. Had
our
real
pleasure,
blast.
man. Our pleasure. If people want to email us, other than John, Matt, where can they get a hold of us?
We're concavityshow@gmail.com. We are at Concavity Show on Twitter and Instagram, and we are Concavity Show if you search on Facebook.
That's right. Oh, also, okay, I'll mention two things. Lastly, I did think of a quote that I love in Infinite Jest in the midst of us talking.
Throw it.
In Mario's tennis video with Hal, Tennis and the Feral Prodigy, the line that opponents and nets can be mirrors is a line that I really love.
Yeah, that's really good.
Like thinking about self-reflection, and especially in the context of like competition, athletic, sport and all that kind of stuff. The idea that you can not only learn from your opponent, but learn from your own reflection in the net is something worth thinking about, I think, which goes a lot to the themes of what we've been talking about for the last hour and 20 minutes. And then also, I wrote a paper on the politics of gender and ethnic representation in the world of Netrunner.
Kidding.
For my critical theory class last year. And I wrote it for my professor, and she had no background in board games or anything, but I gave her this like list of like this PowerPoint with pictures of all the things I was talking about as well. And I put that on academia.edu, which I have a thing on. Awesome. And I posted it on a Facebook group called Women of Netrunner, and like a week ago, and I've been getting lots of people checking it out and giving me feedback on that. So if you want to read an academic paper I wrote on Netrunner, you can look me up on academia.edu. It's called Hacking the Future, the Politics of Representation in Netrunner.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah, that was fun. That was maybe the most fun I've ever had doing an academic paper.
Were you like playing some games of it as you wrote it?
Yeah, totally. Had all my cards on the table and everything. Yeah. All right. Well, Netrunner exists online. There's a site that you can play with other people. Yeah, it's called jinteki.net, just like the Corp. And you can build decks in there, and then you and I could play online together as well if you wanted to do that ever. I'd be super down for that.